Hey everyone, I thought I'd do this short video giving you all an update of the facts of what's happening in terms of the Ukraine war, because I've interviewed people on the pro-Russian side, pro-Ukrainian side, so you get different perspectives. But I think across all these different opinions, the facts get lost, and I thought I'd share everything with you so you're in the loop. So the main development that started a few months ago is the fall of Pokrovsk, or Pokrovsk is about to fall. It's been encircled for many weeks now, and Russia's been trying to take over Pokrovsk for over a year. Now, Pokrovsk is in the Donbas region, which Russia, as part of the peace plan, they're very strict on having that within their control, having that part of Russia. So Pokrovsk, if it falls, and it will fall, it's about to fall, it will be a pretty big loss for Ukraine. It will give Russia a position to continue taking what they call the fortress belt, the Ukrainian fortress belt, which is the last line of defense for Ukraine in the Donbas. Once the fortress belt falls, the Donbas is fallen. Now, the reason this battle in Pokrovsk is very important, and you've probably seen the footage of Russian troops going in with the fog, like a Mad Max scene with the fog, with the cars and the bikes. If that falls, it puts Russia in a very strong position in the negotiations right now with Trump. So that's something we've been covering extensively for the last couple of months. And while people stop talking about it now, it's because I think everyone accepts, even pro-Ukrainians I speak to, everyone accepts the fact that Pokrovsk will fall. Now, Ukraine may surprise us as they have before, but I think that's unlikely. So that's development number one. Another thing that happened recently that we've talked about is that for the first time ever, Ukraine used the American ATACMS long-range ballistic missiles for the first time deep inside Russian territory. Now, if that happened a year ago, that would be all over the news, red line crossed, because Russia was very clear. This is a big red line for them, because it means that technically, indirectly, or even directly, American or NATO troops are helping Ukrainians to launch these ATACMS missiles, possibly pressing the launch button, to strike Russian territory. That is a pretty significant red line, but just considering how far we've gone and the progress that Trump is having on the negotiating table, the response from Russia has been relatively mute. And that's also because of the success Russia's having on the front line and the massive strikes on a daily basis that Ukraine is facing. So that's another major development. And lastly, probably the most consequential development in the last few months is the Trump sanctions on the two biggest oil companies in Russia. That's Lukoil and Rosneft. Now, this is pretty significant. We've covered it. It's not as sexy as ATACMS missiles being launched or talks about nuclear weapons or the fall of Pokrovsk, but it's going to have significantly more impact on Trump, on Putin's position in these negotiations. For negotiations to work, both parties have to have more of an incentive to reach a deal on the table than on the battlefield. Now, Ukraine has the incentive to reach some sort of peace deal because support in Europe and even the US is waning. And they're losing ground in the Donbas, in Zaporizhia, in near Kharkov. So they're losing grounds across the board. Now, that's very slowly, very incrementally, but it is a loss. So Ukraine is not in a good position. Russia, on the other hand, most people see Russia to be doing well economically. People dispute that. I talk to some people, they say the economy is about to collapse, their treasury is out of money. I speak to other people saying the economy is doing really well, and the war economy is leading to an economic boom. It's hard to get the facts, but what we do know is that these sanctions by Trump will hit the economy pretty hard, at least in the short term. So predictions are of a 27% fall in oil and gas revenue year over year in October. That already happened. And the expectation for November is a 35% year-over-year drop in oil revenue. Now, this is pretty significant because this oil revenue is what funds Putin's war machine. But long-term, that drop will be significantly lower. Why? Because Russia will find it will be about 5 to 10% year-over-year. Because Russia will find ways to avoid these sanctions as they have previously. And they'll use shadow fleets and intermediaries to make it happen. So they'll export their oil through intermediaries and the shadow ships without NATO finding out and avoiding these sanctions. But it's not as easy as it sounds. NATO's pretty strict. They've upped their targeting of the shadow fleet significantly, and their patrols are up significantly, and the numbers speak for themselves. And not many people are talking about these numbers, but they're very, very important. NATO has seized 10 times more ships, these shadow ships, shadow fleet, 10 times more this year, in the last couple of months, per month, than they did in 2023. So the average seizures per month in 2022 was 0.2 ships per month. In 2023, that increased to 0.4, doubled. 2024, 0.8, 2025, so far before the sanctions, Trump's latest sanctions on Lukoil Rosneft is a one vessel per month. Post sanctions, that went up to 2.5. In 2022, it was 0.2. Now it's 2.5, over 10x increase. Now that will hit the Russian economy, and that's very important. Pressure Putin to accept a peace deal that Ukraine will be okay with, Ukraine and Europe and Trump. So that's the updates prior to where we are today. And the most important development now is the 28-point peace plan by Trump. Now let's go through it. What I'll do is I'll go through Trump's 28 points, and I'll go through the response from the EU and Ukraine. The Ukrainian response is the more important one. So territory, what Trump's plan requests is for Donetsk and Luhansk, the Donbas, to be handed over to Russia and recognized by the US as Russian territory. Now, this is the big sticking point that we've seen over the last few negotiations, because since Alaska, Russia's pretty strict. The Donbas has to be part of Russia, along with Crimea, of course, and the lines in Zaporizhia and Kherson will be frozen. So that's what Russia's stance was, and their compromise is that we will not request the entirety of Zaporizhia and Kherson, the other two oblasts. We will only request Donetsk and Luhansk, which are the Donbas, and the rest will freeze the lines. That is considered a middle ground for Russia. Now, what Ukraine is asking for, has been asking for, and I'll go through their response to this latest peace plan, for the battle lines to be frozen as they are. Everything is controlled by Russia remains controlled by Russia, and everything controlled by Ukraine will remain controlled by Ukraine. And Ukraine controls about 20% of Donetsk and Luhansk. Numbers vary depending who you ask. Now, another important point here is people will wonder, how long will it take Russia to take over the entirety of Donbass if they continue advancing as they are now? Well, assuming nothing changes, assuming European and American support will remain the same for Ukraine, and there's no capitulation on the Ukrainian side, it would take about 1 to 3 years for Russia to be able to capture the entirety of Donbass based on the progress, the speed of progress they're having right now, which is not that, which is relatively slow and very heavy casualties. Anyway, back to the plan. So Ukraine has to cede Donetsk and Luhansk, and freeze the lines in Zaporizhia and Kherson. Territory they'll seize in Donetsk and Luhansk, that's Ukrainian controlled right now, will become a demilitarized buffer zone. So that's number one on territory. Number two, there'll be a cap on the Ukrainian military of 600,000 soldiers. Now, that's significantly more than the cap they were discussing a few months ago, and even 2 years ago. But it's still a cap nonetheless. 600,000 soldiers is a pretty big army. Is it sufficient? Well, they have a bigger army now. I don't know the exact number. You'll have to fact check me. It's about 1 million troops. I could be wrong. But the cap will be 600,000. They'll also sign a non-aggression pact where Russia says they won't invade neighbors. Sounds pretty meaningless. But should be expected by everyone. But I think that it's an important point here, because a lot of people think that Russia's ambitions go beyond Ukraine. And if this plan is signed, that will can embolden Putin to invade other regions in the Baltic states. Well, in this pact, in this agreement, in this plan, Russia explicitly says they won't invade neighbors. Believe them or not, it's a different discussion. Some people are making comparisons to what we saw in World War II with what Hitler did in Czechoslovakia. Not comparing Hitler to Putin, just comparing the circumstances. That a promise like this doesn't really mean much if the ambitions go beyond Ukraine. There's going to be a comprehensive non-aggression pact between Russia, Ukraine, and Europe. And it has the following quotes: all ambiguities of the last 30 years will be considered settled. It's talking about territorial ambiguities, Crimea, Donbas, etc. So all these different ambiguities will be settled. Next, NATO non-expansion. So that's a big one. So a lot of people say, Mario, and people I interviewed say, Mario, the reason that Putin invaded Ukraine is not because of NATO expansion. I'm not saying this is the only reason, but my stance is that does not make sense. And I've always given the example of Mexico or Canada had an alliance with China and had long-range missiles and defense systems in Canada, as we saw in the 70s and 80s. The US would not be happy to see that. So why would you expect Russia to be okay to have NATO missiles on their border? And in territory, many Russians consider Ukraine to be Russian historically. So to have NATO there is a slap in the face for Russia. So for me, I believe NATO expansion did play a pretty significant role in Putin's calculus when he decided to invade Ukraine. And now we're seeing it as part of the plan. There's an explicit statement that Russia requested for NATO to not expand. Now, something really interesting here is that another part of that point, it says there'll be US-mediated dialogue between Russia and NATO to resolve all security issues. That's pretty ironic, and I pointed that out because the US is part of NATO. So why would Trump mediate dialogue between NATO, that he's part of, and Russia. So it just kind of didn't make sense. It's a bit concerning. It just shows a bit of a decoupling between the US and NATO. Maybe I'm looking too much into it, but something worth noting. If you're a member of NATO, you should have an independent party that's mediating the talks, not a party of the talks mediating their own talks. And you're talking about the most powerful and leading member of NATO. Next, and that's an interesting one. Explicitly says that Ukraine will not join NATO. It will enshrine in its constitution that will not join NATO, and NATO will amend its statute to bar Ukraine from joining. Now, the next point is interesting because I did an interview with Professor Serhiy Plocky. He has a great interview on Lex Fridman as well. I highly recommend. But the professor told me that, Mario, the main reason is not NATO expansion for Russia to invade Ukraine. The main reason is Ukraine wanting to join the EU. That is Russia's biggest concern. And economically, that will be pretty significant for Ukraine positively, but negatively for Russia, because it will limit the amount of business they could do with Ukraine. Well, ironically, in this peace plan that Russia and the US presented, some people say Russia wrote it. I don't think they did. But anyway, that Russia's worked with the US on, it says that Ukraine is eligible for EU membership. So if the whole point is for Ukraine not to join the EU, the reason that Russia invaded Ukraine, then why the hell would they add that clause in there to allow Ukraine to join the EU? Next, security guarantees. So that's a pretty significant point for Ukrainians. How can they know, whatever your belief is, whatever your stance is? I'm sure you could relate to Ukrainians who don't trust Russia. Their country's just been invaded by Russia in 2022 for whatever reason, and they've been bombed mercilessly since then. And I've been to Kiev a few months ago before going to Russia, and I saw how they live. They've been living, in this wartime economy for years now. So for them, one would, again, this war's been going on since 2014. For Ukrainians, they do want some security guarantees, some assertions that Russia will not invade again. So it says Ukraine will receive reliable security guarantees, but that's it. So that's the peace of mind that they're going to get. No additional context whatsoever. The only thing they have is that there'll be European, they explicitly say, European fighter jets in Poland. So two questions here. Number one is, why is that significant? Poland's part of NATO. There's already NATO jets in Poland, fighter jets in Poland. That's point number one. So why is that? How is that a security guarantee? Number two, why does it explicitly say European fighter jets? Why not American fighter jets? So I feel like that point is kind of distancing the US from offering security guarantees, which is a bit weird because I remember Trump just a few months ago talking about how, I think it's Trump or someone in his cabinet, talking about how Russia's okay with security guarantees. Turned out to be false, misunderstanding. But for them to be saying that back then and now to kind of talk about European fighter jets in Poland is a bit odd. Next point, NATO agrees not to station troops in Ukraine. How's that a security guarantee? So the European leaders, especially Macron, has been talking about a peacekeeping force, a British, French, I think German as well, peacekeeping force in Ukraine. And Macron talked about that peacekeeping force after this 28-point peace plan came out, which said no NATO members in, no NATO troops in Ukraine, not even a peacekeeping force. So that's not really assuring for Ukraine. And then there's another point, the security guarantees. Ukraine remains non-nuclear, reaffirming the Budapest Memorandum. So everyone knows the Budapest Memorandum in the 90s was meant to give security guarantees or assurances for Ukraine, and here we are. And now we're talking about, again, about Ukraine being non-nuclear. So now, I don't want to see Ukraine with nuclear weapons. I don't think they should have nuclear weapons. But it's just putting salt on a wound that's existed for decades. And lastly, which I think is pretty meaningless, Russia will enshrine non-aggression policy in law. Self-explanatory, but I think pretty meaningless. Next, there's a request here from Russia to have, I'm assuming it's from Russia, to have full amnesty for war actions. So that's pretty expected. You don't want Russian generals and politicians to worry traveling around the world, thinking they'll be arrested and taken to The Hague for international war crimes. So they want that peace of mind, that guarantee. That's understandable. That will apply for both sides. But obviously, it's Russia wanting security on their end to be sure that they were not going to face these issues. Next, reconstructing Ukraine. So as we know, there's hundreds of billions of dollars frozen assets, mainly in Belgium. There's also some, I think, in the UK and in Japan, funny enough. But the ones in Europe is about 260 billion there. And they're going to use 100 billion out of that to invest in Ukraine, to reconstruct Ukraine. Now, that's fine. But where it gets a bit weird, Shows Trump's cabinet's focus on getting business deals done, which is not a bad thing. The US will get half the returns of these investments. So there's $100 billion there that's going to be invested to reconstruct Ukraine. And out of the returns from these investments, the US will get half of it. Europe, zero. And then to kind of spit on the face, on Europe's face further, Europe has to invest another $100 billion into Ukraine. So essentially, Europe invests $100 billion. The US invests nothing and still gets a return on the $100 billion that's invested from frozen assets in Europe. I wouldn't expect Europe, and I'll obviously know the answer, but as soon as I saw this, I knew Europe won't accept that. Next, benefits for Russia. Sanctions will be lifted, and they'll be reintegrated into the global economy and into G8. And we'll see economic deals between the US and Russia, long-term deals in energy, AI, and the Arctic resources that we've seen talks about before. Other final quick points. That's a positive one. The US and Russia will agree to extend nuclear treaties. Ukraine must hold elections within 100 days. Why not? Let Ukrainians choose their leader. Russia won't block Ukraine's Dnieper River use or Black Sea grain transport. So it's assuring that there won't be any economic warfare, any significant economic warfare on the Russian side against Ukraine after this war ends. And this one sounds silly to me, but I understand why they're doing it, because optically it's really beneficial for Russia. It's a ban on Nazi ideology and the protection of minorities, the media, and religion. That's expected, especially if Ukraine's going to join the EU. These are expectations and requirements to join the EU. There's some things you can't even talk about, like denying the Holocaust in some European countries. So I'm sure these are things that Ukraine will have to do. Maybe some of them they're already legally doing if they want to join the EU, which obviously Ukraine is desperate to join the EU. But why is Russia putting that in there? That's because they could tell the media in the future that, hey, that was one of our objectives, because they've been saying denazification for a long time. It would look bad if denazification is not added into this peace plan. So Russia needs to add that for optics. Now, we're going to talk about the Ukrainian response to this 28-point peace plan and the European response. It's a relatively short response. Ukraine cut the plan by 9 points. It's a 19-point peace plan now. So I'll go through the core changes they've made. The first one is they've removed the 50% returns that the US gets on the returns from the $100 billion fund, the frozen assets, the frozen Russian assets in Europe that will be used to reconstruct Ukraine. Ukraine said, no, look, we'll manage that money, and the US will not get half the returns. I don't blame them for wanting to make that change. Number two, Ukraine will enshrine non-NATO policies. That was removed as well. Enshrining non-NATO policy in its constitution, and for NATO to amend statutes barring Ukraine. So I know how I said earlier, Ukraine will have to add to the constitution, hey, we won't join NATO, and NATO will have to add to their statute, we will not accept Ukraine. So they've removed that. I think that's a mistake, could be a negotiating tactic, but I just don't think Russia will accept the Ukraine in NATO based on the current circumstances on the ground. Next thing they removed is another funny one, the ban on Nazi ideology and related cultural provisions, the religion, etc., protecting minorities, religion, and the media. And as I said earlier, this just so it's not used as a scapegoat, excuse for the invasion. Like, hey, we invaded Russia, we invaded Ukraine because of these reasons, and now they agreed to fix those reasons, so we're ending the war. So Ukraine removed that, and I think that's a smart move. And lastly, full amnesty for war crimes, war actions. Ukraine removed that. I think just to end the war, even though I think everyone should be held accountable for any war crimes anywhere in the world, and any war. I want this war to end. I want people to stop dying. I think, I might get slack for this, but just for the war to end, if this is a deal breaker for Russia, just add it in there for the war to end. And so we move on. Let's try to kind of sort the other points, the NATO point and the territorial point, because that's where it gets even trickier. The amendments they made, three main amendments. Number one, they've removed or raised the Ukrainian military cap, so the 600,000 troop cap. They've removed that. And I think, it's not in my notes here, but I think there's also limitations to the amount of long-range missiles that Ukraine will be able to have in their military as part of the 28-point peace plan. And I think they've amended that. We don't have the exact details. Number two, back to the territories. I'll leave that to number three. Number two, elections timeline. They said, okay for the elections, but let's give us more than 100 days. Fine, that's no problem. I think they kind of, it needs more than 3 months to get back to normal life, etc. So adding 200 days is fine. Even though I think let's just do it in 100 days and get it over and done with. Elections could be held in the circumstances that are happening now with international observers. So I don't think that should be a sticking point. And I hope it doesn't become one. But last seen, I think the sticking point that's existed time and time again, it existed in Alaska. It existed in the meeting that Trump had with Zelensky, and the call with Putin he had right beforehand, and that summit he was meant to have with Putin that he canceled. The issue is territory. And Ukraine again asked, we will freeze the current lines as they are and also we will not recognize the territory currently under Russian control. So Ukraine will not recognize Russian control and the annexation of the territory of the Donbas, Donetsk and Luhansk, and Zaporizhia and Kherson, the territory that Russia currently has under control. And they will freeze the lines. This is obviously a big deal breaker. It's been a deal breaker in all negotiations. And it seems that has not changed. Ukraine has the current stance that we will freeze the lines as they are right now, and we will not give up the Donetsk and Luhansk, the Donbass, to Russia. So this is the response by Ukraine. Number one, first, Russia is making fun of the EU. So they said, why is the EU even interfering in this? Lavrov to Europe, quote, you already had your chances of peace plans and you blew them. So he said every time progress was made, every time agreements were reached, those agreements were broken. It was Europe that oversaw the negotiations of the settlement plan in February 2014. It was Europe that destroyed the Minsk agreements. It was Europe, well, technically Boris Johnson, but still Europe, who held the same position. Europe held the same position that talked Zelensky out of signing the agreements proposed in Istanbul by Ukraine's own delegation in 2022. So that's the infamous meeting where Zelensky was close to accepting the agreement by Russia, which would have allowed the Donbas, Zaporizhia, and Kherson to remain under Ukrainian control. That Boris Johnson flew in and convinced Zelensky, convinced different stories from different people to not accept the deal. So here, and then he says, so now Europe says, don't you dare do anything without us. Well, you already had your chance, guys. You didn't use them. You blew them. So it's Lavrov making fun of Europe. But let's talk about Europe's response, because people love to dismiss Europe, but Europe is still funding this war. Europe is the one buying weapons from the US. Europe can't make decisions without the US, but Europe's economy is still, the EU is a bigger economy than Russia. And if they spend more on their military, they could become a more powerful military. NATO's more powerful than Russia. So we can't just completely discount Europe. I remember, since Trump took office, Europe is funding this war. They are buying American weapons. So I think they do deserve a seat on the table, as much hate as they get. All right, so number one, they removed the following 3 points. Now, again, I'm talking about the main changes and the main points that matter. An expectation that Russia won't invade neighbors and NATO won't expand further. So like, we'll remove that. We don't want to put limitations for NATO. I think it's a mistake. Like, you can argue about territory, understand that being a sticking point, but freaking out, like, learn the lesson that having Ukraine join NATO is not going to fly with Putin. It's just not going to work with this. That led to the entire war. So to keep pressing for that point is illogical unless they're using it as a negotiating chip. Number two, the recognition of Russia's occupation of Ukrainian territories. They want to remove that completely. And number three, remove the 50%, remove the 50% cut that the US get on the investments from the $100 billion frozen assets that will be used as a fund to rebuild Ukraine. Fine. Both Ukraine and Europe want to remove that. That makes sense. The amendments that they want to have, there's a few of them there. They want to raise the troop limit in Ukraine to 800,000 troops from 600,000. Fine, small change there. And Ukraine needs to have enough of a military to protect itself from future invasions. They need to do what Taiwan is doing with China. They need to make it so costly economically and in terms of human lives for Russia that they will not invade Ukraine again. I think it's been enough of a lesson for Russia, but to make sure that they won't invade Ukraine again, they need to have a powerful enough military to ensure this doesn't happen. Number two, territorial negotiations start from the line of contact. Again, freeze the current lines and negotiate from there. Same stance as Ukraine, same sticking point that we've had since the beginning of the negotiations with Trump and even pre-Trump for the last year or two. Number three, NATO. Ukraine's joining requires member consensus. So essentially, it says that NATO members have to come to a consensus to allow Ukraine to join, and there is no consensus in NATO. That's a fair point, because remember, in 2008, in the Budapest meeting, no, it wasn't Budapest, in Bucharest, I think it was, there was a NATO summit there, and Putin went there and gave a speech. But at that time, funny enough, the US was pressing for Ukraine to join NATO. And ironically, it was Germany and France that were heavily against it. And they eventually convinced the US not to accept NATO. Putin had to come in and do a speech to say, hey guys, this is a red line. Ukraine cannot join NATO. So the US was trying to get Ukraine to join NATO. There was a step before becoming a member. It becomes like I think it's like a MAP or something along those lines. But it's not before becoming a member. There's a step, as in a process to get there. They wanted to begin the process, and Germany and France were against that. So here, when it says NATO requires a member consensus, their point is like, there is no consensus that Ukraine will join NATO, so you shouldn't worry about it. But if I was Russia, I'd still have the concern, and I would not accept that. Point number 4, no permanent NATO troops in Ukraine. Keyword here is permanent. So they said there will not be any. So Russia said no NATO troops in Ukraine. They said no permanent NATO troops in Ukraine. So essentially, they want a temporary peacekeeping force before taking that peacekeeping force away. I think it's a fair point that gives guarantees for Ukraine. And my question to Russia is like, why wouldn't you want that there? Those troops will not be able. NATO will not want to attack Russia. I think everyone agrees on that point. And those troops will not make much of a difference. So having a peacekeeping force deters Russia from invading Ukraine and avoids, and I'm sure there's not going to be a concern in Russia that these troops are going to enter Russia. So for me, it doesn't make logical sense for Russia not to accept that point. I think it's a very logical point. Last 2 points is security guarantees. There'll be US-backed security guarantees similar to Article 5 in NATO, with compensation for the US to offer those security guarantees. So there'll be some compensation, doing a business deal to have Trump accept it. There'll be some compensation for the US to offer those security guarantees for Ukraine. As we saw in the initial peace plan, it was European jets in Poland. And nothing about American security guarantees. So here Europe is saying, no, we want American security guarantees. We're happy to pay the US for that, but that's the best way to deter Russia from invading Ukraine. Fair point. And lastly, Russia, but I don't know if it's a fair point actually, because isn't that de facto NATO membership? What's the difference? What's left? What's the advantage of NATO membership? The advantage of NATO membership is if you're attacked, other countries will protect you. It deters anyone from attacking you. Well, if you've got security guarantees similar to NATO's Article 5, then you don't really need to join NATO. And it's actually easier to get those security guarantees than joining NATO. So they're not as ironclad as joining NATO in terms of long-term security, but there's security guarantees nonetheless. So I don't think Russia will accept that. And lastly, they made an amendment to the point of Russian reintegration. They said there'll be phased sanctions relief and not immediate. I think their concern there is that Russia's using this as a stalling tactic to allow them to regroup and keep invading more territory in Ukraine. So what Europe is saying is that we're not going to lift all sanctions at once, allow you to regroup, fill up your coffers, and continue the war. We're going to do it slowly, ensuring you abide by this entire peace plan to make sure this won't happen again. I think it's a fair point. So that's an overview of Trump's 28-point peace plan, Ukraine's response and Europe's response, and the other important developments when it comes to the fall or imminent fall of Pokrovsk, the Ukrainian strikes deep into Russian territory, and lastly, the sanctions by Trump. Now, I do want to point that Trump initially started pressuring Ukraine, and even I think was threatening, I don't know if it's public knowledge, but he was threatening Ukraine that if they don't accept the peace plan, they might stop sharing intelligence and even the supply of weapons, even though Europe is paying for them. Now, we've seen that tactic used previously by Trump. I think he's frozen the sharing of intelligence, but barely lasted a few days before his military convinced him to reverse it. But I wouldn't give too much credence to these threats. I think this is Trump's negotiating tactic. We've seen the same thing in Gaza, and it does work. Zelensky's already responded, did an address to the nation where he said, look, we're at a fork in the road. That was a few days ago, where we would either face humiliation or we would face a negative long-term impacts, or we would face the loss of an important ally, the loss of the US. So I think Zelensky understands how pivotal this moment is. Now, I think what matters, and I think most people are wondering, will this peace plan work? I think the war will end in the next 6 months. Trump is adamant at achieving that. It may end before the end of the year. I think it's unlikely, but very possible. I think give it 30-40% chance. But I think with the economic pressure that he's placing on Russia, the negotiations that are happening with China, those negotiations could include some sort of deal, because China's funding Russia's war, some sort of deal to have Russia coerce or convince Russia to stop the war, or coerce them, force them to stop the war. We've seen India play ball, move closer to. There's a lot of political chess going around. So India is moving closer to the US. If India plays hardball with the US moves closer to Pakistan, which is India's enemy. See, all these different pieces are being moved on the chessboard. And I think enough pieces will be moved in the next few months to put Russia in a position where it has more incentive to accept a peace plan than to continue the war. Now, in terms of accepting this peace plan, we do have a response here from Russia. It's not a positive response, but I don't know if we should take it as face value, because that's part of negotiating tactic to show that, hey, this is not a good deal, to put Russia in a stronger position. Peskov, spokesperson Dmitry Peskov, said the following: as probably the most important statement, I urge people not to rush to conclusions that the war in Ukraine will end soon. There's two ways of looking at this. Number one is throwing cold water on this peace deal, which is not a good thing to see. I'd prefer to see silence than a statement like this. But a second point, and the one I tend to agree with more, is a second perspective, and that's it's expected. They're in a negotiating position. The same way Trump plays hardball, makes all these different threats. Russia wants to show like, hey, we prefer to continue the war, this peace plan. Unless you give us what we want, we're going to continue the war. And we also have the Russian presidential foreign policy aide, Yuri Ushakov, said the following. I'll read out a few quotes. Russia has not yet discussed the details of the peace plan with anyone. Several of the plan's points require serious analysis. They're starting to distance themselves, negotiating tactic. Russia has not officially received the U.S. peace plan, keyword here, officially, again, makes that statement meaningless, for Ukraine yet, but unofficial papers exist. Okay. Russia views some aspects of the U.S. peace plan positively, but other areas require discussions. Europeans are unnecessarily, they don't like Europe because Europe's playing hardball. They're much closer to being on Ukraine's side than the U.S. People are saying the U.S. is more on Russia's side than Ukraine's. I think the U.S. is kind of dealing with reality. And a lot of people are calling this peace plan the 28-point peace plan by Trump capitulation. So obviously Russia would not want Europeans to interfere if they see this to be very favorable to them, which it is. So they said the following: Russia views some aspects of the U.S. peace plan positively, but other areas require discussion. And then they said Europeans are unnecessarily interfering in the peace settlement in Ukraine. And they say Russia and the U.S. are in contact regarding the peace plan, but there has been no serious at-the-table discussions. Again, distancing themselves from any of these points to put them in a better position to negotiate. It's kind of what they're doing is saying, you see those 28 points? You think that's a lot and that's capitulation? Well, we didn't even say we'll agree to those. So you probably should agree to those. Don't negotiate too much because we're just going to walk away and continue fighting and have advancements on the battlefield. Last point, Russia has unofficially received several versions of the U.S. peace plan, which can get quite confusing. And it's already confusing, as you can see from this. I've tried to simplify it for you. There is all these peace plans floating around. Even the Trump's 28-point peace plan, there's some points where different people have reported different things. Different leaks have showed different points. Apparently, the plan that was leaked initially by Axios is different to the plan that was received by Ukrainians that one of their members of parliament released. So it is a bit all over the place, a bit chaotic. Now, a lot of people love to criticize Trump for making it that chaotic. Look, we've had more progress in the last few months than we've had since the war's begun, since the peace discussions in Istanbul. And I think considering the intentions of both sides right now, Ukraine wants the war to end. 70-something% of people in Ukraine want the war to end now. Back during the Istanbul peace discussions, it was about 20-something%. Ukraine was very emboldened with the progress they're having. So Ukraine wants the war to end. Europe wants the war to end. And I would say Russia wants the war to end with the economic issues they're having and the headaches they're having. And they keep, I've done coverage of all the generals that have been purged since the war began, including the latest round of purges. Putin's very paranoid. I think everyone wants this war to end. China's the one that benefits the most, but the rest of the world want the war to end. So I think enough parties want the war to end, and I think there's the environment we're in now is very different to the environment we would have had before. So if I had to make a prediction, based on all the interviews I'm doing and all the coverage I do on a daily basis, I think that this peace plan has enough chances of working to take it seriously, especially after I've seen the response from Ukraine, despite the territorial sticking points, the one that still hasn't been resolved since the beginning. But I do believe that it's more likely to be next year before this war ends. Look, I hope this summary is good for you to help you out. If you want me to do more of these summaries, to start interviewing different people, kind of summarizing all their different takes and try to give you the facts as well, so you can make your own mind at the end, make up your own mind, let me know and I'll do more of them.